Thanks for joining us for Studio 21. For the next minutes, we'll be talking Civil War again in our series. It's ongoing. And our guest is Dr. Donald Bellows, who is a noted professor who's working at OSU, TU, Tulsa Community College. Now, you have a number of degrees. Let's just talk about that first. One of those degrees is from England.
Yes.
Tell me about that experience.
Oh, well, that was one of the better experiences, I would say, more educational than most, because you learn not only in the classroom, but you're learning in society as well about another society, and you get another perspective on the United States. So I recommend that students study abroad.
Well,
absolutely.
That's part of our discussion, because your lecture in this series happens to be with the relationship between Britain and the United States during the Civil War. And one of your basic thesis pieces here is the goal that the South had and the goal that the North had. Now, to start this out, and I'd like you to elaborate, you talked about the South's first goal was military, then diplomatic, and the North's first goal was diplomatic and then military. What does that mean?
Well, the South, they both needed to win the diplomatic war in order to win the military war. The South needed to win the diplomatic war in order to really have a chance to win the military war. And the North needed to win the diplomatic war in order to avoid losing the military war. And that's because the North had more advantages in almost every way: population, resources, industry, railroads, money. They had almost all the advantages. So the South, in order to win, really needed to have outside help, and they appealed to Britain, and they thought they could get British help because of cotton. They thought that cotton would dictate behavior. Cotton was king, as the phrase went, and the British did use southern cotton. About 80% of the British textile mills' supply of cotton came from the South, the American South, and maybe 1/5 of the British population, indirectly or directly, was involved in that cotton textile.
So it was a huge economic issue,
yes,
for
huge
England,
economic, yes,
and for the South.
That's right.
Now, over the years, I mean, the United States fought 2 wars with Britain. The Revolutionary War, obviously, War of 1812, almost came to blows 4 years before the Civil War. What were the attitudes in England towards the United States in general?
Well, they're mixed. The British are, it's a love-hate relationship between the Americans and the British during most of the 19th century. In some ways, they're very much attracted to each other, and in some ways, they're repelled. So the British feel very ambivalent. In some ways, they think fondly of their American cousins, as the phrase went, and in some ways, they can't stand them. Right? It's a family relationship, the sort of thing that you might encounter in your personal life. But yeah, you choose your friends, but not your relatives. Well, so that's sort of the way the British felt about the Americans, and vice versa.
All right, what did Britain love about America?
Oh, well, the British thought of them as their progeny. They reflect Britain, and they have British culture and the English language and a lot of the same political ideas and the constitutional setup, and there's a lot that related. The problem was that the Americans behaved so much differently, and they were a potential rival in terms of international power and trade. They also, I should say, got along because of economics. They have strong economic
synergy
ties.
Between the two.
Yes, and so a lot of the construction of railroads and canals and infrastructure in the United States was based on British investment in the 19th century, a lot of it.
Now, how much of a rival could the United States be back at that point? Weren't they really the sole superpower in 1860?
Yeah, well, they certainly would like that term, I'm sure, but that wasn't the term that was used at the time. But yes, they were the dominant maritime power. They had the strongest navy, not the strongest army by any stretch, but They had the strongest navy, and so they could control international, global issues more effectively than most. And this meant that they tended to emphasize commerce rather than territorial gain during this period.
And because of that, the British wanted stability so they could do business.
Yes, that's right. They want stability. Global peace is going to definitely help them. So yeah, they don't want war. But on the other hand, the United States was something of a threat because you could see that it was growing. It was sort of like China, right? It's growing, and the potential is for them to overtake Britain, which is going to happen. And the more they expand westward, the more powerful they become. And so the British, generally speaking, during the 19th century, are opposed to other countries becoming bigger and becoming aggressive and using war and expansion. And this applied to the United States as much as to Russia or France. I mean, they'd just gotten done defeating Napoleon as of 1815. They had this ongoing problem with Russia, the so-called Asian question. They were already in conflict with them in Afghanistan. They don't like this idea of another country becoming more powerful. Now, they see the United States not as big a threat as Russia or potentially France because they're related, but nevertheless, it's still a problem.
Well, and you have the backdrop that there was a dispute between England and the United States over the, I think it's that line between Canada and the United States, the Oregon area, Canada in general, what's happening in the Caribbean. It looked like there was almost a potential for war in 1856.
So
what was
over
that
Central
about?
America, over the canal. The United States wanted a canal in Central America, and the British didn't really want them to have a canal because the British, as was true of many places in the world based on their maritime power, had managed to dominate Central America, much of the trade with Latin America since its independence from Spain in the 1820s. They were engaged in the Opium War in China, opening up China. They were in India. So they were all over the place because of this maritime power, the superpower, as you say. And they don't really want the United States to come in and take over Central America, build this canal, because that would diminish their position there. So you get the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, which is going to agree that they're going to share the canal. And then, of course, the Americans are not really in a position to build it yet. And so the British can back off of that. But there was a while in the 1850s when things looked dicey.
Well, just to put everything in context, a little bit of a sidetrack here, but this whole discussion of a Panama Canal went on for more than half a century.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, so they're not going to build it until, well, it won't be finished until 1914.
Roosevelt.
Yeah, Theodore Roosevelt.
Well, the diplomacy never happens in a vacuum. And we obviously are focusing on America as American citizens. But what else was England dealing with? I mean, they were looking over at Europe, and they saw some stuff happening in Germany, in the Prussian Empire, in Italy. What were their concerns, and how could that color how they looked at what was happening in America?
Yeah, well, their primary concern in Europe is to maintain a balance of power and contain France and Russia, which are the two biggest potential threats to that balance of power. They want a balance of power in order to maintain the stability in Europe, and because they're on top, they want to keep things as they are. They want to maintain the status quo. So they want to maintain this balance of power, but there's always a threat to that. And during this period, we should say that there are all these people, these ethnic groups that are part of larger empires that want their own independence. So the Italians want to be free and self-governing. They're not. The Germans are not united. There is no Germany yet. It's a collection of many states and duchies and princedom. So you've got these little states, and so there's a conflict. And so the British are in favor of people being able to govern themselves. This sounds good. They believe that that sort of follows their political thinking. On the other hand, they don't want to upset the balance of power. So they're sort of walking a line. how do we maintain things, stability, and still give people the opportunity to govern themselves. So, I mean, the Italians, for instance, are going to engage in rebellion against Italy in order to free themselves, and that
against Austria, the Austrian Empire.
I'm sorry, yes, against the Austrian Empire, and that's going to endanger the stability of the Austrian Empire, and the British don't want that disturbed too much, because that might give Russia the advantage, and Russia then could threaten the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire they want to keep in order to keep the Russians from getting too much control over the Eastern Mediterranean and southwestern Asia. Yeah, well,
you're talking about a domino theory in the middle of the
19th century. Yes, that's
19th century. And you're also talking about England's looking over at Europe, and they see Garibaldi in Italy and Bismarck in the German states, and these are two giants. So there's some powerful people and some powerful forces happening. What's happening in Mexico during this point that may influence thinking by the British about the United States?
Well, so the Mexicans got into trouble with the European powers, especially France, over indebtedness, and the French decided that they would send in troops to collect, and the British and the Spanish were in league with them to collect because they thought you ought to pay your debts. But then the French indicated that they were going to stay, and they're going to put somebody in power in Mexico, Maximilian, and the British then withdrew. Now this was in 1861, at the end of the year actually, and then the British withdrew in the spring of 1862. The United States, of course, is very much opposed to this French presence in Mexico, because this is exactly what the U.S. does not want. It doesn't want European powers in there that might interfere with its growth and its expansion and its interests in the Americas. But they were not in a position to do anything about it at that point because of the Civil War.
Well, the Civil War, we're leading up, and is there going to be a war? Is there not going to be a war? Secretary of State William Seward has got this great idea that will prevent a civil war, and that's let's have a war with somebody else.
Yeah, that's right.
Talk about that, would you?
Well, so at the beginning, when the South threatens to secede and is in the process of seceding, Seward decides that the way to prevent secession and bring the South back into the Union is to have a war with a European power, Britain or France or Spain, and that would cause the South to come back into the Union for patriotic reasons. Well, so he issues some threats, and this doesn't bring the South back, of course, but it does alienate the British and the French and the Spanish ministers.
And it probably alienated Abraham Lincoln, too, because what was his position on that?
Yeah, so Lincoln thought this was a really bad idea. And so he's going to suppress this idea and argue that, no, we don't want the Europeans involved at all. No, absolutely not. That what we need to do is keep them completely uninvolved, because if they intercede, then the most likely outcome would be independence for the Confederacy.
What's your take on Lincoln and Seward then? Because Seward was the odds-on favorite to be nominated for president back then. He had much more experience as a governor and a senator, a better formal education. And here's this attorney and backroom politician named Abraham Lincoln, who doesn't have what you would consider a sophisticated worldview. How did that play out?
Yeah, well, Seward came in when Lincoln won the presidency. Seward was much taken aback because he thought he was going to be president, and so when Lincoln named him Secretary of State, Seward decided that he actually would be Prime Minister, that Lincoln probably would not be able to actually conduct the government, being this backwoods, incompetent individual. And so he thought he would just run things, but Lincoln let him know fairly clearly, but I think subtly, nicely, that no, that wasn't going to happen, that he was going to run things. But Seward initially thought that he could run things.
It just astounds me that with Lincoln's background, that he had such a sophisticated and clear view that no, we don't want those European powers in the middle of this.
Yeah, well, that seems fairly obvious if you think about it too much, because if the primary goal of the Confederacy was to get Britain involved, and have Britain break the blockade because it needed the cotton. And if it broke the blockade and went to war with the Union, then they would win, the South and the Brits together, and France would probably join in because they also wanted cotton. Then the South would win. And
you talk about the blockade, and there was some backdoor commerce going on with the South and Britain. The Trent Affair, what was that, and how close did that situation have to maybe pulling Britain into this war?
Well, it came as close as Britain ever came to engaging in the intervening militarily. This was a result of the South's effort to get Britain to recognize the South as an independent state, and that would give the South benefits.
Now, the situation was Southern diplomats on a ship, and what happened?
So two individuals, Mason and Slidell, are sent to run the blockade, and they go to Havana, and they get on a British mail packet, the HMS Trent. The Union is looking for them, and the commander of the USS San Jacinto finds them. This is Charles D. Wilkes, and he finds them and stops the Trent. And the idea was initially to haul the Trent into a prize court, but the captain of the Trent resists the idea, and the young lieutenant instead just seizes Mason and Slidell and their two secretaries and takes them back to the United States. But that's contrary to international law and amounts to kidnapping on the high seas. And he allowed the Trent and the diplomatic papers of Mason and Slidell to continue on, and they get to Britain. And so the British are just outraged. They are struck by war fever, whereas the North is celebrating this strike against the British because they're very much irritated with British actions up until then. And the South is ecstatic because they think this will lead to war between Britain and the North, which will be to their advantage.
We have news cycles these days where Fox and CNN and MSNBC would have a field day, and it would speed up things. How long did this take to play out, and how was it diffused?
Well, so there's no transatlantic cable. Actually, they had laid it, but it had gone out. It had been disrupted, broken, and it won't be laid again until after the Civil War. So there is no immediate news. So it takes about 10 days, and that's much shorter than it used to be, because before 1838 and the steamships went into effect, why it took about 3 weeks normally. About 10 days for news to get back and forth across the Atlantic. So the Americans weren't completely aware of how angry the British were, and the British weren't completely aware of what the American situation was, but the British were outraged, and they're going to issue an ultimatum. And so Charles Francis Adams, who is the American secretary, the minister to Britain for the United States, he doesn't even hear from Seward on this issue until about December 16th. It occurs November 8th. The news arrives in Britain November 27th. The news arrives, well, Wilkes arrives with Mason and Slidell in the U.S. about November 25th. So it really stretches out. And finally, the ultimatum arrives that the U.S., the Union, must release Mason and Slidell or there'll be war. And that is presented to Seward by the British Minister to the U.S., Lord Lyons, on December 23rd. The cabinet meeting is held Christmas morning, which tells you it's serious. They debate most of the Christmas day. News arrives while they debate that France will support Britain if they don't release Mason and Slidell, which will mean they'll now have Britain and France at war, most likely, with them. So the next day they release Mason and Slidell.
Enlightened self-interest, because that would be a world war.
That would be a world war.
That's,
and that's what Lincoln wanted to avoid, and that's what Seward initially promised. We'll wrap the world in flames, Seward said.
Now, the key issue that we look at is abolition and slavery in terms of the Civil War. Where was Britain on that issue?
Well, Britain is very much opposed to slavery. They had outlawed the slave trade in 1807. They had outlawed slavery in the British Empire in 1833. And by the 1840s, 50s, 60s, most Britons probably thought that slavery was a moral issue, that it had to be ended, that they, in fact, had a moral duty to end it. And they, in fact, used the British Navy to stop ships on the high seas that they thought might be engaged in the slave trade, to stop it. They posted them off the coast of Africa. Because it was still going on, and they were trying to stop it. And so if the North had fought, if it had declared that it was fighting the war to end slavery, then British probably would have supported it, except the British, most of the British still thought, and certainly the people in the British ruling class, thought that war was not necessary, that they wouldn't have to have war itself, that slavery would die of natural causes.
Harriet Beecher Stowe. Uncle Tom's Cabin. How did that play in England? How did it play in America?
Yeah, well, because the British have this sense that slavery is a moral issue and should be ended, her novel, when it came out in 1852, was extremely popular. In Britain, it sold about 1 million copies, compared to about 300,000 in the United States. And you can see from that the British felt very strongly about ending slavery. It's just that they didn't think war was necessary to do it.
They thought it would play out naturally in all countries?
Yeah. Well, yeah. They thought that if the Confederacy obtained its independence, which is what they expected, they thought that secession was a done deal. They thought that it was irreversible and that the North was just fighting reality. So they ought to just let as Horace Greeley at the time said, let the erring sisters go in peace.
Now, Horace Greeley, of course, newspaper editor, former future presidential candidate, nominee.
That's true, yeah, and New York Tribune. So the British thought that the South ought to just let them go free, because once they were independent, they thought that there would be enormous international pressure that would be brought on the South to free the slaves, and that this would then bring about their emancipation.
There's a word called democracy. How did democracy vary in the United States compared to what was practiced in England?
Yeah. Well, the British didn't think of themselves as having democracy. And the British ruling class is really opposed to democracy. They see it as a fatally flawed form of government. So they're not practicing democracy in their mind. They have a representative form of government. They have parliament, but only a very few people can actually vote. And so the United States is a democracy of a whole different order. And it was held up by reformers in Britain as a model. Those people who wanted more democracy, wanted to broaden the right to vote, wanted to reform Parliament, those people pointed to the United States and said, see, here's a model we can use, and Britain ought to reform itself accordingly. And the ruling class generally is opposed to all of that. They think that democracy is a fatally flawed form of government that automatically deteriorates into anarchy and then despotism. And this was based on the work of people like Plato and Aristotle and others in the ancient world who were very skeptical about democracy.
Queen Victoria is the monarch of the British Empire. There's her consort, Prince Albert, and an 18-year-old who would become king in his own right later. What were they doing during all this time?
Well,
and how much influence may they have had?
The influence of the British, under Queen Victoria, we're going to observe the British monarchy really changing from a situation or a program in which the monarch has some real power to basically a titular position. So they have the title, but increasingly they don't have much real power to change things. But they still have to be consulted, and they still have to be brought in, and she can influence what's done to some degree, and especially because she was popular. But the Prince Consort was really very ill, never was in good health. And during the Civil War, when they devised the ultimatum to send to the United States, they had to get the Queen's approval, so they sent it to her, and she showed it to the Prince Consort. He was on his deathbed, as it turned out, but he modified the phrasing so that it sounded much less demanding, less warlike, less absolute. And that probably gave the Lincoln administration, an opportunity to get out, save face.
Well, we have all this diplomatic action that's happening. We have England doing some backdoor things to help the South. Mm-hmm. What kind of backdoor things did the South do?
Well, so they sent agents, the South, the Confederacy.
I misspoke. I meant what Britain is doing.
Yeah, well, the South sent agents to Britain to obtain recognition and get help, get money. One of the most effective of these agents was a man by the name of Bullock, who arranged for the Laird shipyards in Liverpool to build ships for the Confederacy under cover. Right? This was really contrary to the British Enlistment Act of 1819, which, among other things, prohibited the construction of warships in Britain for another power. And so the Laird shipyards said, well, we're not really building warships. These are just merchant vessels. But they were built so that they could be armed once at sea. And Charles Francis Adams, the American minister to Britain, found out about them and tried to get the British to stop, prevent their escape from Liverpool. And he failed to do that until later. So the South is going to get some raiders, some ships. Most famous were the Florida and the Alabama, and those did some real damage to northern shipping during the war. Helped the South some.
Now, the general consensus in England seemed to be that they wanted a negotiated peace, and that went on for a number of years. What was the impact of Abraham Lincoln's reelection in 1864 then on that whole concept and how Britain is going to relate to the United States?
Well, until fairly late, it looked like Lincoln could lose that election. In fact, as late as the summer of 1864, I think he thought he would lose the election. And so he began to look for some means of helping his position, both within the United States and abroad. And one of the ways to do that would be to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in January of 1863. But once, so long as there was any doubt about the war and who might win, and there was a doubt about it, probably until his reelection in 1864, because if he had been defeated, then most likely there would have been support by the winner for a negotiated peace to just end the war. And the British and the French would have happily stepped in to end it, because the British were against the war from the very beginning. They saw it as a useless slaughter, and so they probably would have stepped in and helped end the war, and then you would have gotten a division, even as late as the fall of '64.
Which is ironic. In fact, I think there was just an anniversary a couple days ago of, I think it was the Second Battle of Bull Run, and one of those where 23,000 people died, which is incredible. Dr. Donald Bellows, it's been an honor visiting with you.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. And thank you for joining us for Studio 21.